maps that we made them for all neighborhoods in Rotterdam, and they can be spread. There's also an English version actually available now of these maps. So that's really nice. And in these maps you can see neighborhoods, for instance, see where the water would gather in case of a rain event, and also which would have buildings that would get damaged, so that you can really, in your strategy, focus the areas with the biggest challenges. And what we see here is that if you really start calculating how much water you should store, it's much bigger than you sometimes think. Because this is an example of Amsterdam, where we did a calculation on the necessary rainwater storage capacity, and we actually saw it was huge. It was more in this range. This is a collage we used based on Hamburg, Haven City. Than it is on gathering something within the city with these smaller measures. Of course, they all help, but there's also this bigger strategic assignment where you really need a lot of space that you cannot just like that find in an average street. So in Amsterdam, we realized that we really, next to the more street and park interventions, had to look at a huge water storage. And there we proposed to have a second Amsterdam forest. They already have one Amsterdam forest that in that forest could store 1.5 meters of water. And the great thing is that this also worked in times of heat. So for the city it gives a cool space to go to during hot days, but it also had a lot of ecological benefits. Could purify the water. So you can see that with these connections you can come up with kind of multi-purpose interventions. You can, for instance, also connect it to energy transition. When we presented this to the municipality, everyone said, oh, this is like a worst case scenario, though I thought it was quite nice, but we see that this energy production still has a bit of a negative connotation, though of course we will need a lot of space to find for it, and it could, for instance, be together with water storages. You can also combine it with housing, so these are houses in a more rural setting where you see the houses are developed in a way that it can kind of flood up till here before there's damage. And of course it's really important to search for these points where you can connect it with our ambitions. So when we look at Rotterdam, we also had a look at here, for instance, the housing development. So what we see here is that there are a lot of projects and redevelopment projects that are quite severe. So in these projects you can really include all kinds of aspects like ecology, public space, climate, mobility. It really gives you that opportunity to change a lot. The same with the mobility strategy, because there are a lot of streets that are quite wide, for instance, still have 4 lanes through the middle of the city. And they're now going to this model where they say we don't want that many cars in the city. So these streets were made around the 70s, 80s, where providing car mobility in the middle of the center was still quite a big goal. Now they're going more towards downgrading these types of streets, and you get a lot of space available in the middle of the city. Of course, also ecology. This is the ecological investment strategy, where we also see there will be a lot of investments in upgrading that you can tap onto. Then the maintenance is actually always more than new construction. Here we, for instance, see all the buildings that are owned by corporations. So if you want to do interventions there, you could do it by coordinating with these corporations and asking them to pick up some challenges. But there's also, in general, a lot of maintenance. So here we see maintenance because a new fleet network that will go into the streets. So that means that all these streets will be open at some point, and you have the opportunity to implement a redesign. But the idea of just having a design for all streets and having the budget to do that from only one perspective, that unfortunately is not the case. So you really have to look at opportunities and timings to work with. Then salinity and water availability. I actually expect that will be a very big challenge on the short term, and we're not really aware of that yet, because what we see happening here we see saline water. So what happens is that the water from the sea kind of pressures underground and comes up. So we see a lot of water through the sea, through the soil coming up inland, and there's not much you can do about it because barriers don't stop it because it goes under the soil. And this saline water, of course, is not good for agriculture, not good for ecology, not good for your urban green, because this is all set on having fresh water use, especially the agriculture. And the current strategy is that we use a lot of water from the rivers to kind of flush this out. So we have this water system where we constantly flush water from the rivers through our canals to make sure this salinity disappears. But with sea level rise, the pressure of that salinity will really increase. So with sea level rise, we very often think of flood risk as a challenge, but actually the salinity is really one of the difficult things to address with sea level rise. And that means that in all these areas there will be more and more salt coming. And for some areas they're already having a look at new future perspectives because on the long term agriculture will not be feasible anymore. So it will not be possible to have open ground agriculture anymore within these areas. Smart use of fresh water is of course also important. Here we see the central station where the metro is underground, so there's no space underground. And they made this green bulb to put all the trees in. But of course that isn't the ideal condition for trees, though these are very robust trees already. But then in summer you see this guy with his tank wagon coming to water all the trees. Of course that's not in line with this robust system, smart use of water we would like. And there we also see that soil conditions is something that is very often overlooked. So now there's only like good fertile soil in kind of a square around a tree. And then there's a normal building ground again. So we also see a lot of underground projects that for whoever likes that is really interesting to go into, where they're trying to look, can we connect these kind of squares the trees are in, can we make an underground ecological system that is much more robust, can hold much more water, has better conditions so that we don't every time have to water if needed and not be able to drain the water if it's not needed. And this actually soil condition is super relevant because we saw with our floods in Limburg that it had just rained before, the soils were in a relatively good condition and a lot of the rainwater got absorbed by the soil, but we saw in a later rain event in Germany that there the soils were completely dried out and a bit overworked, and then all the water goes into the canal and it makes the difference between a severe flood or not. When we look at that flood risk, the Netherlands are quite low under sea level. Here we see the darker, the lower the level and the higher the risk of flooding. We have natural dunes at the coast that protect us. Then we have a lot of dike rings and levees, but these boulders are quite vulnerable and some can flood, I think, up to 5 meters. So that's quite a bit. And these unnamed areas that can flood most frequent actually flood the least severe because these are these old kind of sand deposits along the river that are relatively high, so they can flood frequent, sometimes up to once every 100 years. But the severity is not that bad, unless you start building in basements, that's what we do now. And what we see is that sea level rise and the flood risk is really a potential game changer if we look at the whole of the Netherlands, because we'll really have to see how do we protect against that. One of the things we can do is kind of close off all our river arms, and that is actually happening in a lot of deltas currently. It has a huge ecological impact. So we see all around the world that all the big rivers are dammed off from the sea to protect against saline water, mainly coming in. So it's mainly a fresh water supply, so an economic question, but it's really doing a lot with ecology. So in general, the goal is to keep these connections open, because this connection goes all the way to Eastern Europe. I'll show that in a bit, but that will require a lot. Here we see the current strategy of levee reinforcement, and that is interesting, is that in the layer approach that we use a lot in planning, it used to say that buildings are relatively flexible. They have an economic lifespan of 30 years. Infrastructure has an economic lifespan of 100 years, so it's no problem to build a building on a levee, because the building will be gone before the levee needs to be reinforced. Here we see the practical side of that. Buildings are not being demolished after 30 years, and this is really crazy, but we're still, every building that is developed now, in its economic model and in its assessment for instance, climate conditions, we assume that the building will be gone after 30 years, still in this day and age. So that is actually one of the things that now is trying to be changed, so that we take future risk better into consideration. But one of the assignments our office once got for this dike stretch, and then we hadn't been there, is the question, could we elevate this with 1, 2, or 3 more meters, and how would you do it? Just take a second to think about that, if that was the challenge you got thrown at you. And when we got to the location, we freaked out a bit, because we thought, how do we do this? But we do see that this levee elevation is challenging. With climate change, it will need to be reinforced further. First, the strategy was to just demolish all the houses, so we already have dike ribbons where all the houses are taken out. But yeah, it also has, though these houses individually are not monuments, it has some historic value to have these original occupation facts. Then next to the levees, we have the unembanked areas. So here we see the unembanked areas of the city. We're now in one of these old harbor areas. There will be a lot of building construction going on, and what we see is that the current 1 in 1,000 flood risk will in 2100 probably be around 1 in 100. So it will become much more frequent. And we see sometimes quite deep flooding. So one of the strategies is how to prepare for that. We see in Hamburg that they, for instance, did that with elevating the ground floors of buildings. It's the same strategy we're now following here. So every building individually has to be at a certain level above NAP, like or ground level. Of course, this creates strange things on the ground level. And this is a bit our current strategy, that we have this huge protection work. The harbor is behind that. That closes off the connection to the sea if the water gets a bit higher than this, so to protect the urban area. What we see though with climate change is that these gates might have to be closed very frequent to still close at the same level. As I said, the harbor is behind it. And one of the questions is, would we be willing to kind of compromise our main port position or harbor position to protect these neighborhoods? I think the question will be no, because it's a very important economic source, but that means that you cannot close it at the same time, because it will be closed tens of times each year, and the harbor will become unreliable. Another problem with closing it off, as I said, is this connection from an ecological point of view. So here we see the connection in the Netherlands, but this goes all the way to Eastern Europe, and it's one of the few still open connections, together with the Elbe in Hamburg, and the next one is near Le Havre in France. So these are ecologically really essential. So what you could do is not increase the closing time, so higher the water level here, and for instance think of creating edges around the islands in the urbanized areas. The city is a bit hesitant in doing so because currently the official risk is for the house owners behind it, so there's no liability for the city. The liability is with whoever lives there, and they should individually adapt their house. But of course, like, how can you expect people living there to change their house in such a way that it's really flood-proof? And one of the downsides is that currently it just goes slowly over the edge, as you saw. When you create some kind of levee and it does go over, it gets a more dangerous situation because then all of a sudden water comes in. And this subsidence actually made that the middle of these islands are sinking. So the edges are already higher than the middle, and then all of a sudden you can get dangerous flood height in the middle of these islands. If we make such edges, I think currently we have a lot of hard edges in the cities, and there's a lot of emphasis on creating more ecological edges, making this tidal movement of the river more visible, but also doing more ecologically, because you hardly experience it. Of course, if you start making such designs in the Netherlands, it's a bit scary because what if this kid falls in and things like that. We're very detailed, but this is one of the designs that is already created. I'm not sure if you went there. It's a really nice place to go. It's Grisons Island, and there they already created this kind of intertidal area that has a very nice ecology. If you don't want an edge, you could flood protect houses. This is in Dordrecht. And what you see here is that the whole house is kind of sealed, so the water level can go up without any damage. But of course, doing this with each individual house is quite cost intensive compared to having an edge, but officially, currently, this would be the responsibility of the house owners. This is an example again from Hamburg, where they have much more frequent flooding. So it's quite easy for them to do a high investment in preventing damage, because the more you would have damage, if it floods once a year, and you do an intervention, you would prevent a lot of damage. If it only floods once in 100 years, you could say, well, how big is the damage really that we prevent? So here you see that they made this whole kind of layered, quite stony though, now we just looked at the ecology, made these barriers where the water can come up to certain levels, and they even have different entrances, so also a high water entrance. One of the tricky things we see here is that unfortunately sea level rise is unpredictable. So what we see in a lot of plans, as I said in the 1950s, they weren't aware of ecology. They weren't aware of climate change, and what engineers tend to do with making plans is that they say, well, the people making the old plans didn't have all the information, but now we know everything. But what we see that keeps happening is that every time we find out we don't know everything. Because in the plans that were made 10 years ago, we still have much more modest climate change scenarios than now. So it's on the one hand really nice to make these kind of designs, but they're not really adaptive. Because we already see in Hamburg that the water level goes up faster than expected, and then how do you add an extra meter, 2 meters to that? That's quite challenging. So this adaptivity is a really important one. Also the economic scenarios are really important. What is often said is like we deal with the climate impacts once it becomes a really big problem. What is the problem with that is that the interest rate, this is a bit theoretical, but it's always quite nice, I think, to be aware of. And also a bit of something that I think goes wrong in public opinion is that we're not willing to invest in climate mitigation, so preventing climate change now. But if we need to deal with climate change later, that might be at a point where we already had a severe flood, and then we kind of wake up and think we need to do something. But if you want to invest as a country, usually you need to borrow money, and the interest rate for borrowing that money is very decisive for your national budget. If your country is a riskful country to invest in, that interest rate will go up. So we now have a very good rate against which we can loan money. if we wait till climate challenges really become bigger, and we already see that some banks are kind of degrading the portfolios of people having owning buildings in the Netherlands because of the risks, then it will also become more expensive to invest. So we're thinking a bit like, we'll invest when it's really needed from a climate perspective, but at that moment it might not be possible to do so because we don't have the money to do that. And here we see some different scenarios that in policy making are taking into consideration. You can have more moderate or more severe climate change, but also high socioeconomic development where you can make really qualitative cities with a very nice combination of water, urbanization, and it gives a lot of quality. But if you don't have the money to invest in them, you might need to make choices that you don't want to make about which areas to protect or not. Then heat, also a very important one in all urban areas, and we see that this heat, because of urban areas warm up, because of their kind of stony material, also keeps hanging within the city. And here we see these areas within the city that are most hot, and we see that these old centers, high density, big green, really heat up a lot together with a lot of company terrains. For the company terrains, it's actually quite easy to take action, but of course you would need to invest in it. Some of the areas are hot, but it's just a mistake in the model, because for instance this was recently developed and there were no trees yet, so it comes out as very hot, but you already know that in 15 years when the trees have grown, it will be fine. But I think in general, to really address heat, buildings should be designed in a different way. And here we see an example of Singapore, where you really see that they, in social housing in this case, develop skyscrapers in such a way that every house can always ventilate throughout the house. So you can always open windows against each other, so that always at night you can cool houses. These kind of strategies here in Rotterdam are not yet applied. We're currently working on the climate adaptation strategy of Grisons. And what we see there is that, for instance, because it's in the harbor, in the architecture plan they say you should build with concrete and glass. These are your materials to build. Then if you look from a heat perspective, that's the worst thing you can do. What we also see is that with heat, this adaptivity of people is quite poor because it takes quite large investments. So what we see is private renters in low income rental houses will not be able to do anything. Because having a good heat system might be around 10,000 euros, like the sun protection system. And it's not something you're going to invest yourself in a rental house, but in the low income rentals, your private owners will also not do that for you. In the housing corporations, we also don't see any heat measures yet. We see a lot of isolation measures to make sure that the energy is reduced in winter, but actually that can increase the heat challenge, because the same glass that makes sure that in winter the heat stays in, make sure that in summer the heat stays in. And it can be like a 4 to 5 degrees difference in your house, so it can really heat up. So this new type of design, I think it's essential, but it's not really addressed yet. We also see that a lot of apartment buildings are not allowed to, on hindsight, add sun protection on the outside because of the architecture of the building, and then the whole building should be the same at once. So then air conditioning is the only solution, and actually that heats up the city again. So it cools the house, but it heats up the city. And here we really start to see, and in the study we made a lot of profiles for the cities, that you can really see which city has what type of inhabitants, are they able to invest or not, do they have a private garden or not, so that you can better fine-tune your climate adaptation strategy. And as I said, it's now I think also available in English. There you can really see what could I do in this neighborhood in relation to the inhabitants we have. What is actually also interesting is that one of the things we're now seeing this is a distance to full spaces study, is that actually different group of inhabitants have different appreciation of measures such as greening the city. And we're now starting to find out that a lot of active inhabitants that show up at participation meetings, they're really big green lovers. They like to have more green, a bit of rough or natural green in their neighborhoods, but actually the people that don't show up at participation meetings don't want that. And in areas with a lot of people that don't have the capacity to adapt their house to heat, it's very important to have sufficient cool spaces in the city. So as a municipality, provide these cool spaces for people. This is, for instance, an example of what used to be a football field and is now really displays with benches, trees, so that people can go there. And to create a cool space, it's good to know you need at least 200 square meters of continued shadow. So it's not having some trees in the street, but it's really creating a lot of space. Here we see some newly developed public spaces that are clearly not up to date yet with this heat challenge, I think, because this will of course really heat up. And what is also a possibility is that there are some spaces that are actually cool, but they're not a public space yet. So you can also search for spaces that are cool but not public, and add something to it. So we also made a lot of maps for that. And here, of course, there are a lot of options to also connect it to the urban ecology, having the types of green that really support ecology. And what is good to know there now is that in the city we currently have a lot of solitary trees, or we have like grass on the ground, but we don't have a lot of the bushes kind of in the middle, and that is essential for ecology. And this was done so because of kind of social safety on the street. To always have eye on the streets, to have no bushes. But if you look from this perspective of ecology, you will need to add like a lot of this middle ground bushes in places where it's possible. Here we made a whole toolbox how you could in different local situations create cool spaces. So that is for the city part. I also have some more information about the harbor. And if we look at the Rotterdam harbor, this is really a link to Germany. So we see that most of the goods that get into the harbor actually get transported elsewhere. So that is one of the questions you'll have to ask if you want to keep that position to facilitate others. It's really interesting to know that a lot is already going through pipelines, but road is one of the bigger modes of transport still. And the reason that a lot of things need to go by road is that it's just not packaged in a way that you could put it on boats. So boats and trains are, of course, more sustainable ways of transportation. We see a lot of emphasis on more circular material flows. So reusing old material that, for instance, comes out of buildings, recycling more. But what we see there as a challenge is that there's no real strategy behind it. So if we would, for instance, recycle, do we want to do that in the Netherlands, or do we want to ship everything to Asia and get it back as product? So there's still a lot of these type of questions that make it difficult to have a local strategy for circularity. And maybe what we also see is that if we now start to have a more circular economy, but we still have our oil-based economy next to it, that will require a lot of extra space. So you can use the oil areas and oil industries that are kind of in time decreasing in the harbor to really make them into circular hubs. But in the meantime, you will have to have them both next to each other, and how do we find the space for that? One of the challenges we really see there, and here we turn the map of Rotterdam, so here's Rotterdam and here's The Hague, is that a lot of the industrial terrains that you need in your city along the water and are there to have this circular economy are now being transferred into housing areas. So we have the right types of terrains with the right modality over water to facilitate this economic circularity, but the pressure on housing development is so large that that kind of overrules this necessity, and all these locations will be transformed into housing areas, which will mean that your circular economy has less place. We get partly to rent outside the city, but that means that if you want to make a creative industry there, everyone will have to travel there by car, and you will have to bring all the goods there by car. So that is a real big challenge. So in that sense, it's really important to make sure that even with new developments, we really keep this space in the areas for the creative industries to process these type of materials, and they simply need a lot of storage. Because if you have a building, a larger building, and you take it apart, the surface you need to store that material is almost as big as the building itself. Also in the harbor, of course, this climate adaptation is important. There are mainly the companies are responsible themselves to make sure they are climate proof, because these are not houses that have that 100-year lifespan. It's much easier for them to adapt and invest. So that was it for now.